Hey everybody, Jeremy Bourne and Scott Christensen here at Gray Matter. Good to see everybody today. Weird circumstances today in the cyber world, especially for anyone dealing with water and wastewater utilities like Gray Matter does across the country, across North America. You've probably heard by now some of the reporting and the headlines around what's going on in Minnesota, and we're going to get into it here today. We've gotten a lot of questions from clients, folks we work with about, what they need to be ready for, what they should be thinking about in light of what's going on in Minnesota and probably other states as well. And so we wanted to grab a little time with Scott this afternoon to kind of go through, what's happened, kind of what the sight lines are on this particular incident and what to think about, if you're at a water or wastewater utility and you're concerned about your cybersecurity resilience, essentially. And a lot of these things that we'll get into today are things that you should be doing all along and aren't that much of a lift to get into and to check to see if you're doing them. So that's why I wanted to have Scott. Scott, welcome. Thanks for being here this afternoon. Appreciate it.
Yeah, glad to be here. And
so if you could kind of set the stage of kind of like what you've been hearing and seeing, about this incident.
Yeah, well, I'll also say to your point, Michigan, as of this morning, is experiencing some of the issues, what's going on, right? So as everyone knows, kind of critical infrastructure gets targeted by nation states all the time. So what we're seeing happening is there's a concerted effort coming from specifically Iran in this scenario, targeting Minnesota critical infrastructure, specifically water, looking for where they can find publicly addressable devices and find ways to leverage that publicly addressable capability into some type of targeted attack. It's a pretty vast campaign, so it's really going pretty wide, and they're really shifting around the different techniques they're using, from ransomware to direct disruption. Really, because really the whole goal is just to disrupt. They're really not. It's not a compromise looking to ransomware and take money. It's not a compromise looking just to hack and attack a device. Their whole goal is really to take these systems offline. That's the primary focus appears to be at the moment.
Yeah, and tell me, so what were some of the utilities noticing in those early days, like that told them that something wrong had started? Those indicators of attack.
Yeah, I think the first was the command feedback loop. They would issue a command, and the response back wasn't mapping to what they were doing. Right, shut off valve, open pressure, whatever it might be. They were noticing they weren't getting the response back. So it was, firstly, they thought system issues, and they started to investigate, and they started realizing it wasn't a system issue. And so they started really going in to start finding out that, yes, they had been compromised. So the first goal was get everything into manual operations, which is not necessarily a sustainable mode, but that was the first real notice, was that the issue SCADA commands, HMI commands, and they noticed that they weren't getting the command response from the actual physical assets.
Yeah, and Scott, I think if you're in the industry, you might get this, but if you're not, then it's a little harder to understand. Like, why would small water utilities be an interesting target for anybody to try to exploit?
Yeah. So a couple of paths, right? So if you start off with, there's a lot of attacks are just purely opportunity based. So as I go to recon, I've got a specific exploit. I want to see who could potentially be affected by this exploit, and that becomes my target, right? So that's the most common. But what we're seeing with this is a little bit more targeted. So this is intentionally looking for, where can I do the most damage and escalate up to more impact, right? So when you think about from that perspective, the larger city utilities are much more difficult. They typically have very robust cyber departments. They've got a lot more program around how do I protect my infrastructure. Where there's a disconnect a lot of times is one of two things. One is interoperability, right? A lot of these communities and municipalities interoperate with other local municipalities. So I may not be able to get the big city, but I can get the suburb that's connected to them. That might be my avenue into a bigger, large scale attack, right? So that's the first why you target a lot of the suburbs and municipalities around the larger cities, but the largest cities aren't the first target. That's the first. The second is because of the lack of investment in cybersecurity on the smaller utility side. It's a risk acceptance model where they say, hey, we're not the bigger target. We don't think we're necessary, so we're not going to invest in a lot of the cybersecurity things we need to do. We really learned this back in 2024 with Aliquippa, that even if you're a small utility, if the opportunity presents itself, there's a high likelihood you could be attacked just because you're in critical infrastructure.
Sure. And I guess the good news so far is that, there's been no danger to actual water quality or anything like that. So
Yeah.
it's mainly been the loss of visibility of systems, the inability to communicate with remote systems, and so they've fallen back on those manual procedures.
Yeah.
Which can be part of a plan, I guess, to deal with it. But I think a point that you make about these sorts of incidents is that, part of it is the cybersecurity tools you have, but a bigger and maybe even more important is how you deal with it once there is an incident. So can you kind of explore that for us a bit and kind of what you need to have in place?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a couple things are really highlighted within this is there was a big focus on first publicly addressable controllers.
Yeah.
Typically, from a security perspective, that's a no-no, right? We really don't want to see publicly addressable for this exact reason. Controllers in themselves are, I don't want to say dumb compute, but they really are. They're very basic compute, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're designed for a very specific function, and they do that function really well, but that's all they do. So making them publicly addressable gives the opportunity for an attacker to constantly interrogate and find ways to make that vulnerable system, do what it wants, right? Expose it, disrupt it, whatever it might be. So that's the first, is understanding what of my devices are publicly addressable and evaluating, is it worth having that risk associated with it? That's the first, I think, through. Second is, do I understand my boundary? Do I have a good boundary perimeter set up, whether it be firewall or some other mechanism? Really establishing that lockdown boundary and understanding what crosses it, I have control over that traffic. That becomes pretty critical in the scenario. And then last, just legacy asset. Knowing what vulnerable legacy assets I have on my network can be really critical, because that's what we're going to look to target, right? The current modern PLC that's currently patched and in a much more kind of modern, industry 4.0, 5.0 mindset is a lot more of a challenge than, say, a first gen 20-year-old PLC that's not been patched in 10 years, right? So
Yeah.
Understanding where those are, that's really the kind of a hygiene we'd like to see.
Yeah. And when we say publicly addressable, like from my standpoint, I boil it down to like, there's services on the internet that are basically Google for finding these devices that will find, an IP address out there that's part of a water system. And, somebody looking for it may not even realize that it's part of a water system at first,
Yeah.
but then, with a little more digging, you can get a lot of information about that device that's out there. But what would lead a utility or really any organization to have anything that's publicly addressable? What are maybe the shortcuts or the legacy systems? What is it that you get into a situation where you even have these sitting out on the web for them to be found?
I would say the vast majority is, I'll say this nicely, and I don't mean this as derogatory, but ignorance, not being aware, giving a
Yeah.
public IP address, not having policy in there, what the risk is, right? Because when we first designed a lot of our control systems, 20 years ago, networking was new to these environments, and we weren't thinking of anything being publicly addressable. The old air gap conversation, right? Closed loop systems. That was our mentality. So we weren't really thinking about publicly addressing anything in the controls network. Well, now that we've created kind of this convergence between IT and OT, and you start to see analytics platforms and cloud platforms and all the different modernization efforts come, we started connecting the overall network, not thinking through the devices on the network might be susceptible to this kind of issue or risk, right? It was really the modernization got tagged on to what was already a closed loop system, and no one started thinking through, well, wait a minute, some of my assets, we weren't thinking through this ever being publicly addressable because this network was never going to be publicly addressable. Now that I've connected the overall environment, the system, now I've got that avenue available to me. So maybe I should rethink architecture. That's the first. The second is, a lot of times it becomes part of a modernization effort. I want to get my data to the cloud. I want to take the leverage of that kind of component of the cloud, and that not necessarily it's a bad thing, but I think if you didn't properly architect it, you didn't think, do I really want command and control going all the way to my level one?
Mm-hmm.
It's a bit of a concern, right? And sometimes it's a conversation of, are we willing to accept that risk? Or have we even evaluated that risk? And a lot of times the customers aren't even aware they are dealing with that said risk.
So what are some of the things that you look for that, you're working with a client, water, wastewater, that they can do kind of, maybe on their own to prepare to have a better, more resilient cyber posture, even before you bring in a third party?
Yeah, and that's why I jumped right to this slide, right?
Yeah.
So this is not me, this is not Scott, this is CISA and the FBI. These are things they recommend you do, right? So uh, first, we've kind of hammered on it a lot, right? The disconnect internet exposed OT devices, right? There should always be some gap between, whether it be a DMZ where you publish everything into a read only, specifically like the one we see a lot of times it's leveraged is historians, where they'll put the historian publicly addressable because they want to pull all that valuable tag data. Well, our recommendation is you typically replicate your OT historian into the DMZ and let people pull from the DMZ. That way your risk is outside the controls network. Then PLCs, they should not be directly accessible remotely. That's a scary, scary thing. I typically don't really like to see that. And now they say MFA for remote access, so multi-factor authentication. I actually say, let's make sure you have a well-planned remote access, right? Don't have a bunch of, I'm going to pick on a particular application. I don't mean anything bad by it, but don't have a bunch of TeamViewer. Don't have a bunch of RDP. Don't have a bunch of easy to access things that can be leveraged to attack you, right? Don't use default credentials. And when I say don't change default credentials, do yourself a favor, go with complex credentials as well. Password 123 is constantly being exposed, right? Those are things that, or even the name of your city and 123, right? Those aren't really complex credentials. Review your firewall rules. One of the things we see a lot is how often any rule gets created for troubleshooting and gets forgotten about. Well, that's a very permissive password firewall policy, right? For those who don't know, any basically says anything from this side of the firewall can talk to anything on this side of the firewall. So it's really allowing this ingress and egress of data with no enforcement. I think the next one, segment IT and OT, we preach about this all the time, and in the FBI, it's really around those standards, right? Really separating out the risk. And for me, as an OT cyber guy, I always consider anything that's not my OT network, not my ICS, everything else is untrusted. So moving into that kind of zero trust, and whether it be your business network or the internet, I really don't care. I want to lock down my trust across that boundary. And monitoring industrial protocols. I think a lot of times we try to apply what works well on the IT side, but we really want to look at the industrial protocols, because if I'm just looking at TCP/IP and Ethernet on the OT side, that's just the packet carrier. It's not really the important data. So I want to be able to understand what's going on in Modbus or OPC or Profibus or Zigbee or any of the 30 or 40 different industrial protocols we might run into, because that's really where the command and control is. And that's really where the scary stuff can happen. If I'm just looking at that kind of TCP/IP layer, I'm not really seeing the intrinsic value in OT. And be able and prepared to operate manually. I think this is a critical one. I can tell you about our experience with a city that had got an exposure to an event a few years back. One of the biggest challenges is as they went to move to manual operations, they actually had to pull people out of retirement because they had so few people who had ever actually operated manually. They were so used to automation that most of the people with 5 or less years who had been the vast majority of the day-to-day operators just had never operated in a manual situation. So they were limited in what they could do. So they literally had to call people up out of retirement and say, hey, could you help us out? So having a plan for manual operations, training on manual operations. A lot of times we talk about tabletop exercises. That's the value of these kind of things, because it'll identify those kind of gaps.
For sure. And so this is great advice from CISA and FBI. Mm-hmm. I think you have some more detail too about like in the next 30 days as opposed to a year, steps that you can take as well. And I just wanted to make sure we shared that.
Yeah, absolutely. So verify your PLCs don't have internet accessible. You mentioned there's a couple applications out there. The hackers use it, and both security professionals, both sides will use it. The one I typically
believe me, these are not hard to find. If I know about them,
exactly.
Truly, they are not esoteric.
Exactly right. So Shodan is probably the biggest one.
Yeah.
There's a few others out there, but start with that, right? Run it, make sure that my PLCs aren't internet addressable. That's a big one, right? Review how your people are remote accessing everything. Make sure you're reviewing all the different methods, because you'll be surprised how often one maintenance engineer has got a special way he does it because a vendor told him to do it. He's never documented it. He's never told anyone else about it. And now that becomes the way that an access can be leveraged. reset privilege credentials, right? This should be done in pretty cyclical, right? You want to make sure anyone who's got privilege that you're constantly reviewing, auditing, and resetting those credentials. You don't want some password that it's been the same password for 10 years, because every employee who's left, everybody who's been through, who's had access to that. So now it's just by nature is already compromised. Validate your backups. And when we think about backups, don't just think about your data backups. A lot of times that's the focus, right? Do I have a good drive with all our system backups? Think about your process backups, your configurations, your ladder logics, your programming logics. How are you backing those up, and how quickly can you restore? In my world, a lot of times when we're talking critical infrastructure, it's not about mean time to detect, right? How quickly I can detect an event. That's very important. But a lot of times it's mean time to recover that becomes really important. How quickly can I restore those systems? And then really moving into, if I have to go manually, are we prepared? Do we have the right procedures in place? And that kind of really attacks to confirm your incident response, right? Do I understand what we need to do if an event occurs? The time to figure out incident response is not in the middle of the event, right? So now if you're not currently in an event, now's the time to plan. What do we do in case we're potentially attacked, right? That becomes just absolutely critical to that is, hey, we don't want to be chickens with our head cut off. How do we respond? How do we have the right plans in place? Is it documented, and is it communicated out? Because it may be that frontline maintenance engineer that we critically need, but if he's not aware of who to pick up the phone or what systems to engage with, then you're going to miss very valuable things that could mitigate or minimize the impact.
Right. And just from my reading of the coverage so far, it was using backups and, operating manually were the two things that I saw the water utilities saying that they have implemented like right away to try to, just get a handle on the situation and make sure that they can keep their systems running.
Yeah. And that's the critical thing, right? Because we always talk about in OT, the most important priority is availability. So even if you're operating manually, even if you're operating through backups, at least the availability is there as you restore automation, as you restore more critical functions. I always go back to, and I've said this almost every time I talk water and cyber, probably the most impactful thing I ever heard from a superintendent of a water utility was, Scott, no one cares about us until the tap doesn't work. So that's really what you're focusing on. Can we keep the water flowing? Can we keep the tap working? So these are the things that can help you mitigate and minimize that impact.
Right. And I and it doesn't, some may think it's, not so serious, but like I actually did see that discussion too in the coverage, is that, some of the utilities were estimating how much water they had available, to keep the system going if for whatever reason they weren't able to restore function of a pump, that sort of thing. So they do have reserves, but they needed to all of a sudden know, even in a place like Minnesota, which is nothing but water, how much, they had available that was, treated. So it's just like an interesting change in your operations all of a sudden and unexpectedly.
And it really shows, and this is something I talk about a lot of times, how in OT, the cybersecurity program should be attached to your maintenance and operation programs, because the data from each are so valuable to each other that interoperability, that interconnection of data is critical, right? Because you do need to know those things, right? Hey, who can do manual operations? Where are we gapping of experience there? What is our water supply look like? How long a window do I have before a disruption becomes impactful to our constituents, right? Those are all kinds of things that become really critical. And that's really that delineation that separates, traditional IT cyber from OT cyber. Is those are the components that become very, very valuable to knowing what kind of window I have for mitigation or remediation and response. So that becomes really important to know those kind of data and facts, so that when you go to jump into your response plan, what safety net you're working with, what risk you've got, where your alignments might be. So and then it becomes the old cyber is a team sports, because I'll be calling in those manual operators to help out. I'll be calling in, my IT where security lives to mitigate out, what if it's a ransomware or if it's just an individual, the ways that we need to mitigate out so that we're not repeating this issue. Because we've seen this in the past with the municipalities where they survived an event, and within 6 months, because they didn't mitigate out what was the root cause, they repeat the event because it was the same avenue in the second time as it was the first, and you're redealing with the same headaches.
Yeah, that's true. And I know that to be the case. And those are some huge headaches.
Absolutely. Yes.
All right. So let's look at some of the longer term remediations that folks can think about.
Yeah.
Strategically.
Yeah. So when you're taking it, and one of the big things I always talk about, and we've seen this with some very big success stories we've had with a lot of water utilities, is start thinking about OT cyber as a program, right? You want a longer term goal. And I'll say this: don't think of cyber as a destination. There's not going to be a point at which you plant your flag and you say, I'm secure, I'm done. It's always going to be a journey. So as you go through this journey, these are the things that I would recommend you to start off with, right? Comprehensive OT asset inventory, knowing what I have, what its current version is, also where is it in its life cycle. For example, if a device has been end of support, end of life 2 years ago, there's not going to be a patch to mitigate any new vulnerabilities. So that's always going to be a risk. You may want to accept it, but then you can put what we call compensating controls in place. Second, passive network monitoring. This is one I cannot hammer on enough. Hugely valuable, because the one advantage we have in OT security over IT security, our networks are static by nature, right? If it's operating in good standing, don't touch it, leave it alone. I can set my watch by when a PLC is going to talk down to how many bits it's going to talk. It's going to be very, very reliable in that way. Passive network monitoring then lets me say, let me know anytime it's outside the norm. Sometimes it may be a planned outside the norm. Hey, we're in a maintenance window, or we're changing something out on our systems. But I then can decide if I need to jump in. But if it changes behavior, for example, PLC now talking to the internet that wasn't in the past, or PLC receiving commands from someplace outside our domain, that's something I want to be able to respond to, and the passive network monitoring will alert me to those things. The next is Purdue. It's really important. Purdue and ISA 95 are really important in this space, right? Because you should have some segmentation across the logical processes within your environment. Specifically, starting off with a DMZ between IT and OT, or OT and everything else, really be more accurate. But starting with that separation, that logical separation there, you can decide if you want to go to the depth of the 5 layers or the multi layers that ISA 95 recommends. But really just starting with that segmentation. The reason that's so important is it allows you to keep the risk within segments of your network, so that you can make sure that the whole ship doesn't go down if you're exposed. And then moving to a secure remote access kind of becomes an offset of segmentation a lot of times, making sure people are accessing systems the right way. Making sure that you've got it locked down, they're accessing the right systems, and you're in a kind of a review cycle of who has remote access and who has access to different parts of our system. We've seen a lot of exposures where we'll say elevated access was not monitored, and 6 months, 9 months later, it became an exposure to the network. Vulnerability management really becomes, if you look at a lot of the passive network monitoring tools, they feed really well into the vulnerability management space. And when we talk vulnerability management, and this is where it really gets overwhelming for a lot of people, you start off with, here's all my assets and here's all my 8, 9s, and 10 CVEs. How am I ever going to take care of them? This is where vulnerability management plays, right? It's not just saying, hey, you have these 1,000 8, 9s, and 10s. It's also understanding, where do I prioritize those 8, 9s, and 10s? Which are the ones that are most likely in the next 30 days to impact me? Because those should be the ones I prioritize and mitigate. And that really moves into kind of regular tabletop exercises. As I start to put plans in place, as I got my governance model in place, I've got policies and procedures in place, test them, right? And with the great part about tabletop exercises, you can gamify it. You can make it enjoyable to go, hey, let's go through scenarios. Let's really try to understand where our gaps are and understand if the plan we put in place, does it work in a real world scenario? So it really allows you to test that. And then alignment with standards. And I think we kind of put it down, 7, but I think it could be even higher, because the standards are really important because they give you an objective view for where your risk is in your environment, right? It's not Scott's opinion or Jeremy's opinion or Gray Matter's opinion. It's what they say are the best practice and standards across the industry. If you use the NIST CSF 2.0, it's a fairly, I would say easy, but it's a more palatable beginning. But then you move into more granular standards like 62443 or NIST 882, right? But starting with CSF really gives you a palatable beginning, and then you should mature into the more granular environments. And then getting into continuous monitoring. As I said, that static nature is something we can take advantage of. Monitoring that, looking for that anomalous behavior, logging what's going on in your environment. In case an event occurs, you can make sure that you're closing the right doors. That all becomes really, really critical as we move forward.
And it allows you to call in those resources.
Yeah.
These water authorities are working with, the FBI, with
Mhm.
CISA, because they have some visibility. I mean, there may be others that don't even know that they're part of this,
Oh,
incident at this point, and so they can't ask for help. And so, their systems are still being exploited, unfortunately. So,
I
um,
would I
yeah,
would
go
say
ahead.
that's
Sorry.
a certain. I would definitely say that's a certainty, Jeremy,
Yeah.
that there are a number of utilities, the smaller municipalities without the resources, that are probably compromised and exposed and don't know why and don't know what's going on and haven't been able to pull the resources because they may think it's a system error or a misconfiguration. They're not thinking necessarily on being attacked by a nation state.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, why would that be your first thought? I mean,
Yeah,
except for, I guess, one of the giveaways, is that you pointed out in the beginning, nobody's asked for anything. It's
yeah,
not a ransomware
yeah.
situation. Nobody's trying to exploit, money. It's more of like a demonstration of
It,
power, of the ability
it's a
to
disruption
exploit
campaign.
these systems. Yeah, it's
It's spot
disruptive.
on. Yeah, it's a spot on a disruption campaign. It's literally to say, let's see how much damage we can do to critical infrastructure in the United States. That's the target, right? So they're not looking to be gentle. They're not looking to collaborate and
Mhm.
get paid. They just want
Right.
to do damage as much as they can.
And yet it's still opportunistic. They're
Mhm.
they're doing it when there's something exposed to the internet,
Yep,
like the easiest target to scoop up. They're
yep,
not necessarily going to great lengths to find these targets. They're ones of opportunity.
yeah, and it's why would they need to go more complex when there's
Yeah.
enough available
Yeah.
targets today, right? Is if you think about it, if we're just talking Minnesota now, Michigan, and we're talking already a half dozen to a dozen over the last 10 days, you know, think about the number of municipalities. For example, at Gray Matter, we provide SCADA services for 1,500 plus water utilities. So you know that really shows you, there's probably 20,000 plus municipalities that have water districts in the United States. I'd say the vast majority of them are on the smaller side and are probably a
Mhm.
target.
Yeah.
I'd say probably higher than that. If I'm being honest, I'm being conservative, saying 10,000 targets. So,
Mhm.
before you can even get to the more complex, the more protected targets, I've got 10,000 I can already deal with today, and that's pretty disruptive. So,
For
from a
sure.
stated goal, that gets us there.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think we've given organizations a lot of tools
Mhm.
that they can use on their own, but Scott, talk about how you and your team, to kind of wrap things up,
Yeah.
bring in value on these points, and other things that may be a little bit beyond the scope of, the few things that you can do on your own tomorrow.
Yeah. So I think the first is, as I mentioned, we're fans of the standards. So we're experts in these standards, right? We do between 50 and 100 water utility assessments a year, helping people build out the program. And I know the big fear, oh, it's going to be a bunch of product pitch. No, actually, the assessment's completely product agnostic. The way we want to approach it is we want to identify every risk we can, and we approach it in a non-disruptive way. So we come on site. We want to review documentation. We want to capture traffic through a span port. So passively, we want to identify all the risk in the environment. And then we take ownership. We say that if this was our environment, these are the ways we would mitigate these risks. And we want to do it collaboratively with you because it's not necessarily, hey, we've identified these 10 things, you should fix these tomorrow. It's more of, hey, here's things we've identified as risks. Here's a rollout plan of how we could mitigate these over time. And here's the intrinsic value to doing these things, right? So if I look at it and say, hey, and I'll give you a great example. One of the things we run into a lot of times is unsecured protocols, right? If we identify that, you don't necessarily need us. We're happy to help with that. Yeah, but you could look to moving to secure versions of protocols. But then there are more complex things. Hey, Scott, I don't have a dedicated OT network engineer to help me do a segmentation. Do you have resources for that? Yes, we've got experts who've done this for years and years. Or I need to implement these vulnerability tools. Can you help us with this and help us kind of ingrain this with our process or operationalize this? Absolutely, that's something we do a lot of. And even have some that we're completely turnkey. Scott, we're not going to build an OT cyber team. We're not going to build that. Can you guys build us a team and support us in this way as a managed service? We're absolutely happy to do that for you. And that's definitely something we do and we offer.
Yeah, and that's something that, especially organizations that, aren't the major metro systems, it's hard to find trained, SCADA engineers, control engineers, that are ready to be on hand at 3 a.m. You
Yeah.
know, so there's organizations like Gray Matter that actually make that available, so that if there is an issue, if you do need monitoring, you know, that can happen, and that can help supplement your overall strategy for cybersecurity.
Yeah, spot on. And what's unique about us, I think, a lot of times is you can take the whole life cycle, the design and assess to implement to operationalizing, and we can do the whole life cycle. Or if you'd like just to do components of it. So it really is structured. Our services are really structured around meeting you where you're at, right? How do you like us to accomplish the goals? If it's, you got a lot of internal resources you want us to leverage, fine, no big deal. You want us to provide a single resource that can capable of helping you guidance, consult with that, or full service. It's really, where do you want it? What's the most palatable way for you to consume us? We'll make it work.
All right. Well, I think this was super helpful today, Scott. I appreciate you coming on. And I want to encourage people to visit us at graymattersystems.com. Under the Tech Hub section of our site, Scott has a piece that summarizes a lot of what we talked about today in the context of the Minnesota incident, and going over what water. So you didn't have to catch it all on the video here. It's available on our website. You can also check out our upcoming events. We really try to come from a place of education, especially when it comes to cyber, because there are headlines like this all the time, and there's so much to track. So you can engage with us in our events as well. We have some Think Do leadership events coming up in August and September, and other ones throughout the year with our Empower Up series. So I encourage you to check that out, and check out Scott's article, and I'll drop it in the comment section of this post if you're watching on LinkedIn and YouTube as well. So, all right, Scott, we'll keep watching this one. I appreciate your time today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right. Thanks.